Hello and welcome to the Digital Insight, the technology, procurement and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those who are leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Welcome to the Digital Insight, the official podcast series for CPO Strategy and Interface magazines. Today, I'm joined by Richard Ham, CEO of Fine-Tune. Together, Rich and I discuss why the world needs a company like Fine-Tune, how it works with clients to deal with nuisance expenses, and how it specialises in categories where procurement, for all its best intentions in becoming more strategic and driving value, tends to fail even now. Richard, welcome to the Digital Insight. So one thing I always like to ask then to sort of kickstart the conversation and so that our listeners can understand who you are and essentially why are we talking today, can you give me a bit of an idea then as to, who are you? Who is Rich Ham and your experience and your career journey and how you find yourself today with Fine-Tune?
Well, I'm a happily married father of two. That comes before any of my business life. Got a great wife and a 12-year-old daughter and 8-year-old son. And as it relates to my business career, which is really just my means for trying to help them along the way and help the family along the way. I was a journalism and political science major in college. Went to Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and my first job out of school was working at the local newspaper where I worked in advertising, but I also wrote a basketball column. I wanted to write about sports, and along the way, though, one of my advertisers was the leading player in the U.S. Uniform rental space, Cintas Corporation, the uniform people, and they at some point they offered me a job, and I was becoming a little bit concerned about being in a revenue generation position in a shrinking industry in the newspaper industry. So I took the job Cintas offered me, and honestly, it wasn't the long-term fit for me, even though they're a great company and have been a very successful business for a long time. And so I was probably inclined to leave and do something else after, 3 years there. But I did have a light bulb moment one day where I decided, I think there's a good opportunity for a consulting solution to be applied to this particular expense. And while I didn't have a word for it yet, I knew that there was something unhealthy about the way that the expense that I was responsible for selling at Cintas affected customers, and the customer particularly being the buyer or the expense manager in procurement. The burden on that person always felt like an outsized burden in relation to the monetary priority that the expense represented. It was a relatively small expense for most of my customers, and yet it seemed to take up a lot of my customers' time. And they would all say similar things like, "Oh, it's always something with uniforms," or, I'm trying to work on MRO or logistics, but I keep getting pulled into stuff that's going on in this category. And so we ended up, my partner and I, my founding partner, Matt Smith, and I decided that it was a good opportunity for a consulting entity that would just focus on this specific niche, to enter the space. And what we decided was very important was that it would be a full service solution that not only did, strategy setting, baseline assessment work and strategy setting and open market activities and sourcing and negotiations, but actually that would be a solution that really represented true category ownership, where we would not only put our clients in a better place contractually and strategically, but then stick around to own our work and make sure that the intended results of our work on the front end actually were the results that our clients got what they signed up for, because that was one of the things that I had seen time and time again on the supplier side. Was there was just this big gap between negotiation and execution in the space over time. And by the way, we knew when we started the business, Fine Tune, when we started it, we knew we have this very adaptable business model, basically a model that says, hey, buddy, I'll save you some money on X if you'll share the savings with me, X being uniform rental at the outset. We knew we would apply that model to other expenses. And so over time, we've diversified to two other categories, but we're kind of a deeply, deeply immersed firm in a small number of categories. So we don't have broad expertise. We like to say we're not a firm that knows a little about a lot. Fine Tune knows a lot about a little. And so we specialize in a very small handful of categories that include now the waste and recycling industry and the pest control industry. And the tie that binds all these expenses is that we've come to describe them all as what we call nuisance expenses. And it goes back to that original thought process I had when I left Cintas to start Fine Tune. That was back in February of 2002. The nuisance expense realm is our realm. We are going to diversify into other nuisance expenses over time, because we believe those are our areas where we can offer the most relief to our clients in procurement, to where Bob the buyer, who's been increasingly burdened in a lean procurement era and can't truly do justice to his lower tier expenses, his tail spend categories. Fine Tune is a solution for a small handful of expenses in that arena, and we drive a surprisingly high percentage of savings within those smaller categories. But then critically, and I think especially critically in times like these, we make sure the savings actually happens, and that the size of the checks our client organizations cut to their suppliers in those spaces actually go down over time. It's not about projection of savings. It's real hard dollar savings throughout the life of implemented contracts. And so this is where we are today. We are, I believe, at the pinnacle of the areas that we specialize in. Even though we do three small things, we do them for really large clients. Some of the biggest accounts in the country within our targeted categories are among our clients, a growing host of Fortune 500 firms. And we've been on an upward trajectory now for 18 plus years.
Oh, fantastic. And obviously on this show, we talk a lot then about these broad, huge transformations, and we talk about procurement and how it's evolving, and how, as companies are investing in procurement transformation, it's talking more about a transformation of the perception of procurement and what that means to a business. Now, while you're not strictly coming at it as the CPOs that you are dealing with, procurement function, you are dealing with expenses, you are dealing with people in the procurement space. Based on your experience, just over your career, of course, but also with Fine Tune, how is that kind of larger transformation of procurement conversation sort of bled into the conversations that you have and what you see on a day-to-day basis with Fine Tune?
Well, we certainly have, given that we have now close to a 20-year perspective, we have seen the changes that you're talking about happening in more and more clients through the years. A desire on behalf and a determination on behalf of many of our clients to become more and more and more strategic with corporate-led, procurement functions, and so that I think, though, it needs to be said, I have to acknowledge that our visibility is in three relatively small categories, not unimportant categories. They're critical to many of our clients. To take a food processing business like Cargill, for a company like them, all field workers wear uniforms, and waste and recycling is a massive category, and as is pest control, and it's critical in the food space as well. And so, we deal in very important categories that do tend to get the attention of procurement, at least at some point, but I won't pretend that they rise to the level of energy, logistics, MRO, And so I'm not certain. I need to say with an appropriate degree of humility on the front end that I'm not altogether certain that my impressions are representative of the broader trend. And the reason I say that is because of the nuisance nature of the categories that we specialize in, because they tend to be maddening categories where buyers don't tend to get what they sign up for. These categories behave a little differently than some of the broader and larger categories that procurement may dive into. And so, from my vantage point, we specialize in areas where, despite procurement's best efforts at getting more strategic, at driving value, they tend to fail, frankly, quite a bit. There have been, I see a lot of my clients' history. Take a category like uniforms. The most often historical arc that I see over the last 10 to 20 years within that category is what I would call fits and starts. Like every 3 to 5 years, they try to do something strategic. But ultimately, it's a relatively small category. They can't justify a continuous level of vigilance or dedication to it. And so, the strategy really revolves around contracting. And they've probably done a pretty good job of that. And they've done their best to advocate for operators and P&L owners. But at some point, procurement had to eventually, as I like to say, lob a contract over the wall to the operators and P&L owners and hope that the intended results come to fruition. And unfortunately, the categories that we specialize in, it doesn't tend to go that way. There tends to be a rapid and continuing erosion of the efforts of procurement in our spaces. So, I think probably procurement tends to add a lot of value in a lot of categories that I'm not familiar with. It just so happens that in the categories we specialize in, there tends to be, I think we specialize in, frankly, Dale, and this is kind of its interesting own subtopic. I think we specialize in the kinds of categories that tend to drive a wedge between procurement and operations and P&L owners, because the promises of procurement tend to get broken very frequently. And the field goes, hey, this wasn't 30% savings. It wasn't even 15. You told me it was 30. And so that's my perspective is probably a little bit skewed, but that's frankly what we've seen. The efforts of procurement to get strategic in these spaces have not been nearly as successful as they probably have been in others.
But how have they changed then? So, obviously you're becoming sort of 20 years of experience now in those particular categories, and as you say there, they are driving a wedge between procurement and operations, and those conversations, those transformations haven't been as successful or even as strategic as they have been in other areas. But what has changed? If you could go back to day one with, you kickstarted Fine Tune, you had your first client conversations, and you kind of, got the ball rolling. And fast forward to now, what's sort of some of the biggest changes you have seen based on the conversations that you do have?
Well, I mean, I think the answer there is relates to having now been through, and not through, but been in two historically significant periods of economic contraction and crisis. From 2008 to 2010, of course, we dealt with the Great Recession, and now with the COVID-19 pandemic. My clients have generally all been through two significantly trying periods of crisis. And as those clients have necessarily had to tighten their belts through those time periods, one area that has been squeezed by the highest levels of those organizations has been procurement. They've been so resources have been leaned out in many client operations. Folks have been asked to do more with less. The expectations, the need, frankly, for cost savings hasn't lessened, but there has been an expectation that those savings are going to be produced by, on balance, smaller teams. I would say the most when Bob the buyer, our persona for the buyer, we often use Bob. Bob the buyer, when Bob the buyer retires, very often what I'm seeing is ABC Widgets isn't hiring a new Bob. They're going to the other 6 buyers on the team and saying, congratulations, you all can split up Bob's work. And of course, on a buyer to buyer basis, that might mean a little more opportunity for savings for each buyer, but it necessarily also means a steady lessening of each buyer's ability to truly do justice to their full portfolio of expenses. And so I would say that's the trend that I've seen is a leaning out of procurement. I recently talked to a global, a large Fortune 1000 firm's global head of indirect, and he told me that his indirect team managed almost $3 billion in annual expenses. And I asked how many buyers are on the team, and he said about 30. So easy math there. I said, so nearly 100 million in annual spend per buyer. And he kind of chuckled and he said, yeah, obviously I know that's a big number. We can't possibly really manage 100 million per buyer. That's not, we're going to use the term manage very loosely. What we are trying to do is add value throughout those areas. But it doesn't all come from the buyer. It comes partly from the buyer and partly from implementing strategies with firms like yours, where we're finding third-party solutions that augment our, admittedly lean resources.
So looking then at Fine-Tune, so you've already told us about kind of the core idea behind it and how it came about. So I'm going to sort of ask this next question almost as a putting you on the spot, as it were. But why then? So for our listeners and for any potential client in the future who might be listening in, why does the world need a business like Fine-Tune?
Well, I think my starting point in answering that question is I am going to assume that every potential client, every prospective client that I talk to is interested in actually saving money and actually advancing their business's P&L interests. I have seen some dysfunctional procurement teams where the results are less important than the projection of savings, where, I've even met buyers where I actually think the optimal scenario for them in any particular category is every 3 to 5 years, I implement a savings initiative in category X, and then over the intervening 3 to 5 years, my costs rise back to the levels that they were at prior to the previous initiative, and then I do it again in 3 to 5 years. And because now there's low-hanging fruit that has reemerged within the category. And of course, that sounds to me like horribly unproductive behavior and not the kind of behavior that drives a business forward, that drives bottom line results. But I would be lying if I told you that I don't see that from time to time. We do. But I always proceed from the starting point assumption that my prospective clients truly want to advance their business's interests both in the short term and in the long term. They want to win over P&L owners and operators with their good work. They want to drive lasting value for the business. And so when they do, when that assumption proves to be correct, I think they find that they need Fine-Tune because, to answer your question, because they can't possibly duplicate what we do in-house, even if you were to assume, let's assume at the start that the expertise is there, that they don't lack the expertise that we would bring to the table, and they don't lack the tools that we would bring to the table. Even just the mere resources, just allocation of resources alone, they can't possibly dedicate themselves to the categories that we specialize in, which probably are lower tier for a typical buyer that I'm working with. Our categories represent anywhere from 1 to 10% of their sphere of responsibility. So I think it's fair to say they should probably not garner more than 1 to 10% of that buyer's time. Well, our categories require more than that. The categories that we specialize in you won't get what you sign up for unless you're substantially more engaged in the joust on an ongoing basis with the expenses. You need to be defending your bottom line with a certain level of vigilance that I just don't see. I don't see the resources as being there in almost any businesses that I encounter to kind of muster and dedicate that level of attention to these levels of expenses. So that's answer number one. Just plain and simple, can't muster the resources. However, let me stress, one of the reasons we love nuisance expenses as an area that is particularly optimal for outside management, for expert management, is they tend to be highly complex expenses. And if you think of every expense that a particular buyer has ever bought as falling somewhere on a spectrum from simple widget out to complex services, we reside way, way, way out at the complex service end of the spectrum. And at that end of the spectrum, there's more to know on an expense by expense basis, obviously. And when there's more to know, there tend to be more unknown unknowns. And so we believe that in the expenses that we specialize in, expertise adds more value than it would for a simpler expense. I think that's not the most controversial statement. And so expertise is, I think certainly a corollary answer to your question. And when I say expertise, we didn't build our business around middle managers. In the early years, we had to by necessity because we couldn't afford the best and brightest from our targeted categories. But over time, we've been lucky to attract some true, leaders of the respective spaces. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about, Brian Gamble, who's my VP of Uniform Services and is now also taken on the title of COO at Fine-Tune. He spent 20 years at Aramark Uniform Services in the U.S. And when he resigned, he was the youngest of their 9 regional vice presidents. He ran an 8-state region in the Midwest. I wouldn't trade him for anybody that I've met in that industry and now over 20 years of exposure to it. He's an absolute genius, has forgotten more about that expense than most people have ever known. And so when I deploy him on behalf of one of our clients, we're changing the game dramatically. All the unknown unknowns that would have been present for even the most astute buyer, even the buyer with the highest levels of intelligence and broad procurement chops, just can't hope to know what this guy's known. He's been in the belly of the beast for decades now. So you're bringing to the table world-class experts dedicated in a vigilant fashion to the expense. And then the real clincher for us along the way, which is the third part to my answer, you have resources, you have expertise, and then finally you have tools. We have armed these experts with the proprietary software that we have developed, which we have recently titled EMOTE, stands for Expense Management, Optimization, and Auditing Technology. Our software that we've developed has been built around these niche expenses and the leading players in the industry's invoicing characteristics. At its core, it's an auditing application, but it's really evolved over time into a much more sophisticated and holistic expense management tool, where we are auditing not just for strict contract compliance, but also for the overall health of the category. We're identifying trends in our clients' spend that, while they may be technically compliant with contracts, are not necessarily healthy for the bottom line. And so, in the end, when you deploy world-class experts armed with these customized tools, and they are singularly focused on these little niche areas of a business that the average client, cannot possibly spend more than a couple hours a week on, I think in the end that is a quantum level of game changer for most of our clients. We tend to take them from playing checkers in these spaces to playing high-level advanced chess. So that's the answer.
And I want to pick that apart a little bit then. So obviously you've mentioned throughout this conversation so far about nuisance expenses, and you talked then about, you have that expertise and you have people who have forgotten more about these categories than somebody with, the strongest procurement chops could ever learn. obviously, and I said earlier, we speak to a lot of people who, and rightfully so, will boast and talk proudly about their investments in their procurement spaces, how they've taken greater control, they've invested, they've put technology. They now sit in a position where they have more access to all these expenses, as you were, than they ever did. How would you go about, like you said, how would you go about sort of explaining to that person, well, you may actually still be missing something. There may still be some nuisance expenses. How do you kind of break through to that kind of potential client who's sitting in a position of, well, we've made all the investments, we know exactly where all our money's gone and where all our savings are, when you know different?
It's a good question, Dale. And if we had built up a business that only worked for dummies, it wouldn't be a very good business. We needed a solution that would actually advance the interests of very smart people. and I'm happy to say, when I look at our contacts at our client businesses, they are very smart people. We deal with people that know more than we do about 95% of what they touch. So it doesn't. I think our effectiveness does not need to be an affront to the ego of the buyers that we interact with and even the executives that we interact with. Rather, there just has to be some humble acknowledgement that, okay, in an expense that amounts to 3% of what I touch, and yet has been 100% of what this industry leader, this titan of industry, has touched over the last 20 to 30 years. Well, of course, that person would be like, if my next waste and recycling contract were negotiated by Curtis Hill, who spent 13 years as a regional vice president at Waste Management, who presided over the nation's largest material recovery facility for multiple years, and who has spent almost 30 years in the waste and recycling industry, well, probably he's going to know a few things that will shift the playing field to my advantage that I just wouldn't have thought of, getting back to those unknown unknowns. So yes, the ego of the buyer can be a difficult one to overcome, but it just seems so uncontroversial that I do find most of our clients say, well, yeah, of course a senior level executive who spent decades in the belly of the beast is going to know some things I don't even know that I don't know. And so that's answer number one. But of course, like most answers, there's layers of complexity to it. And the secondary part of this, Dale, is that even if procurement absolutely nails it from a contractual standpoint, and I have seen accounts like this where we go, okay, here's the work that Bob the buyer did 3 years ago, and it was exemplary work. If I were to grade his work, if an industry insider were to grade the waste and recycling contract that was negotiated 3 years ago, it would get an A, a 96%. Only missed a few minor details that we would have changed. That still doesn't mean that they ended up getting a good deal. There's a phenomenon that we see all the time in our categories, which is good contract, bad deal. and the two are not mutually exclusive. A good contract can reside in a file folder on Bob the buyer's machine, and simultaneously the checks flying out the door for uniform service or waste and recycling or pest control can be 40% higher than they should be. And that reality exists for myriad reasons, ranging from new product additions and new service additions that get added to the account after the deal gets done, to non-compliance, to faulty implementation. In most instances, the contracts in our space don't even ever get implemented properly from day one, and then they tend just to get worse from there. And we did a project for a large uniform account just over a year ago now, where the contract was so good. We looked at it, was some of the best contracting work we had ever seen. And we said, well, gosh, once we get our hands on this invoicing, I wonder what we'll find. Well, what we found was the products and services that were contemplated in the contract represented only 37% of the total spend. And in the 2.5, 3 years since this contract had been signed, the spend had slowly migrated further and further off contract. And so what you had was, for 37% of their spend, they had an outstanding deal. And for the other 63%, it was really bad. And in the end, it was 35 to 40% above market value, when in fact, 2.5, 3 years prior, a very good contract had been signed. And so good contract, bad deal is a a commonplace occurrence in our space. And so when that is considered, it's entirely possible that Bob the buyer, with his big ego about his work, is right. He is good at his job. He did do good work, but the P&L still wasn't really helped because what was lacking was that continuous dedication and vigilance, that engagement and immersement in the category on an ongoing basis, that ongoing connection between procurement and operations and accounting, that ensures that the intentions of the deal actually see the light of day. And that's not Bob's fault. In most organizations, it's just a simple matter of lacking resources. This is one of the costs of lean procurement is, you're not going to be deeply immersed in the categories that are quote under management. And I put quotes around that because I find that the definition of spend under management seems to be, in my estimation, horribly flawed. I have a lot of prospective clients and clients that I talk to who think a category is under management simply because a strategically negotiated contract is in place and the plants are using that contract. And I think, well, that's a woefully inadequate definition of managed. That doesn't say managed at all to me. That just says contracted. But is the spend reflecting what the contract intended? Well, that's a very different question. And to me, a category is only truly managed if there are strategies in place that ensure that the intents of the contract, actually see the light of day.
Talk to me a little bit then about the way you work with clients. So from the sense that obviously you approach clients, you work with clients, you're coming at it from an angle that you've already admitted you might have more knowledge than they do. They might have no more knowledge than you do. Obviously, you've kind of got to tailor the conversation around that. But talking about the relationship in the sense that you've got to make sure that you aren't approaching and working with people and effectively telling them, what for, and not listening to what they need. You're just approaching them with what you think they need. So how do you ensure that the services you're offering, the conversations that you're having, essentially you're listening to customers and that you're being driven by the customers and not just what you think is the right thing to do?
This is a critical lesson in our line of work. And one of the things that I've found through the years is we're not really in the uniform business or the waste and recycling business or the pest control business so much as we're in, above those specific realms. I would say we're in the expense management business, but even above that, we're in the three-party relationship business where, we are injected as a third party into a relationship that has historically been a two-party relationship. And that requires a certain understanding that we are going to have to be a little different in each and every one of our client interactions because we're going to have to be an extension of a vast collection of clients that are all unique. And so we have to learn, who each client is and what they want, what success means for them on the front end, and then go adapt our behaviors and be an extension of that client in their pursuit of whatever it is they define as success. And so, there is certainly when you enter the equation as the expert, as we are in our spaces, there is a certain level of authority that comes with that. And sometimes we are telling our clients, look, I know you don't think you need this, but here's why we think you do. But there's also a lot of listening, and that happens early in the process of getting to know our clients and, making sure that we have a clear understanding of, hey, when the dust settles on this project 3 years from now, 5 years from now, what will success look like, and making sure that we have, tailored our actions, in a way that is, built around arriving at that endpoint. And so, there's a lot of listening, and then, but to be clear though, I think our clients do expect a certain level of authority when we enter the equation. Hey, this category has been driving me crazy. Tell me how to fix it. And so, that does help our cause a little bit. I think in a lot of cases our clients are kind of throwing up their hands when they meet us, because they've been so perpetually frustrated by the areas that we specialize in.
And that lends itself quite nicely then to, we've not really touched upon it at all, but it's kind of the elephant in the room right now as we speak. But obviously the pandemic that's going on right now, that's impacting obviously not just human life, but obviously the way businesses are operating, and particularly what you've just been saying there now about changing behaviours and listening to clients and sort of working with clients. How has that changed? I know it's a broad question, but how has Fine-Tune and yourself and the way that you're having these conversations and the way that clients are approaching you, how has all that been impacted and changed with what's going off right now?
Well, we are a nicely recession-resistant business in that, when times get tough, I think, first of all, the appetite for cost savings in general goes up. It's a good time to be selling cost savings. But I think even more than most cost savings solutions, the secret sauce in a lot of respects at Fine-Tune is that the cost savings are so very real that our business revolves around savings that stick. There's no projection mechanisms. We don't get paid in advance for initiatives based on their intent. We get paid on results over time, and so and our work happens in categories where that has historically been. As we get back to where we started, there's been a friction between procurement and operations because the promises of procurement have tended to get broken for whatever reason, not really because of the fault of procurement. Sometimes it's the fault of operations, frankly, and other times there's no fault. It's a changing landscape, and it just stuff happened along the way that were flying below the radar, and as a result, what was supposed to be a 30% savings 3 years ago turned out to rapidly erode to nothing. And so I think in a time like this, the focus on the P&L and the bottom line becomes more intense, and firms that are positioned around really driving bottom line results and managing the P&L in a vigilant fashion are popular solutions. And so we've found that we've certainly seen an increase in sales activity and in successes landing new clients in recent months for those reasons, I believe. And so it is my hope that that organizations, there's the one of the hashtags you'll see about the COVID-19 pandemic is that we're all in this together. And it is my hope that will translate down to the corporate level, where organizations that may have historically had some fracture and some infighting, from interdepartmental friction, will come together, and that procurement will focus more intensely than ever before on driving results that will not just be good for their own compensation plans, their own the documentation of savings initiatives and driving towards an annual number, but with a mind to what is really going to make me popular with my operators and with P&L owners. What is going to move the needle of our stock price? What's going to hit the P&L in the most positive fashion over time, because we're in a crisis mode, and I need to advance my business's interests over the short and long term. And so, I think that's happening. It's still early, of course, but our conversations in recent months have revolved around, hey, we need P&L relief. I have to shake out the cushions. I have to look in areas we haven't looked at. I have to be open-minded about new strategies. All of this has been said, with some frequency to us in the last, 2.5, 3 months. And so I'm hopeful that will continue. And as it relates to Fine-Tune internally, we're in a mode of really wanting to help our clients. We feel very fortunate that we're in this we have a recession resistant business. We already had a certain percentage of our workforce around the country that worked from home, so our transition was relatively seamless. And so our people are driving in high gear right now to advance our clients' interests, and we want to be part of their success stories 2 years down the road, when they say we emerged from from that period of crisis and are now as strong as ever. Hopefully we can be a small part of those stories.
And we talked about earlier about how particularly obviously from Fine-Tune's perspective, the categories and the conversations that you've had, how they've evolved from day one to where we are today. Obviously then with what's happening right now, what do you think that's going to do in terms of, now I've asked a lot of procurement people this about how the procurement conversation has reached a certain point and then obviously COVID-19 has happened and it's still happening, and that's it's going to dictate that conversation for who knows how long. Do you think it's going to knock it back, or it's going to progress it, or it's going to move it forward a little bit? Because obviously, for example, people who may have never even sort of batted an eyelid at procurement, for example, now suddenly know what it means and know what value it can bring because obviously of what's going off. What's your perspective from that then?
Yeah, it's a good question and a complicated one. I think the answer is probably both in some respects. Certainly procurement reputation and importance in organizations has been pushed to the forefront recently in ways that it is not normally. Certainly the procurement and provision of critical supplies and the demands that have been forced on many of my clients to deliver not only critical goods and services, but also to deliver them at a time where the marketplaces are strained and where that's not an easy task. Those requirements that have been foisted upon procurement have certainly pushed those organizations forward in ways that I think are noteworthy and are garnering attention, and that is that's unavoidably true right now. But at the same time, I think there's always a push and a pull, and there's a cost to where resources have been forced to be rededicated here in the recent past, and we see those costs manifesting in the areas we specialize in. I think it's fair to say that tail spend categories, lower tier categories that are either unmanaged or loosely managed, are probably garnering even less attention than they were 6 months or a year ago. And there's no doubt that the for-profit suppliers in those arenas are likely to be capitalizing on that reality. If they have an obligation to, they have shareholders, and they are tasked with growing revenue, growing profitability. And so I think in some areas, procurement is probably actively going backwards right now because they just simply lack the resources, especially with the new demands placed on them, to effectively manage a growing list of lower tier expenditures. And so, it's a complicated question with a complicated answer, but I think more than ever, it's incumbent upon procurement to be mindful of making sure they have strategies that are not just limited to strategically negotiated contracts across their portfolio of expenditures, but strategies that bring a certain level of vigilant and dedicated management to the categories that they own, ones that are P&L minded, and ones that will also put tools in place to keep them from getting distracted by those categories that are under their management. Because, of course, when you're needed for truly mission critical goods and services, you can't be getting sucked into distractions in lower tier expenses. And so whatever solutions you have in place in those areas certainly ought to come with some level of protection against those distractions. So I think forward in a lot of ways, backwards in some ways, growing in prominence and effectiveness in some ways, and struggling to keep up in others.
And my final question, which I promise isn't going to be complicated, and hopefully the answer is going to be a little easier in terms of, because it's basically it's coming back on your experience, and this isn't strictly related to what's happening right now, but just something I like to ask everybody and particularly yourself, where you said, you're a business that has and is working its way through two, huge economic crises, for lack of a better word. Based on all your experience, what would you, if you could give one piece of advice, whether it's to your younger self, whether it's to somebody who's kind of in a similar boat, about how to succeed, and I don't necessarily mean to guarantee success, because if we all knew that, we'd all be following that advice, but just something that you think is something that would help people can navigate the right path in volatile and constantly shifting environments.
Well, I'm going to go, in this case, I'll bring you into the back room at Fine Tune. As we've grown rapidly in recent years, it seems that every year when we arrive at our annual meeting at the end of the year, there's a handful of new faces that we've added to the team. And so I've always wanted to make sure that we don't stray from, the underpinnings that have made us successful. And that's, that becomes, of course, for any organization, and increasingly a threat as you grow. And so I always make sure to hammer away at this one fundamental, secret sauce of the business, if you will. And that is, I always say, what really has set us apart through the years has not been the expertise, though it's impressive, has not been the technology we've developed over time. It's not a sophisticated or sexy or advanced thought process. It is something as simple as this: let's stack up good days. Let's have a good day today, have a good productive day today, and then do it again tomorrow. And it sounds so simple, but it's one of the hardest. The ability to remain in that mode and not allow days to end in a way that where you look back and you say, well, that was unproductive and that really didn't advance the business's interests. And the reason I'm choosing to give you that answer here today is in a time of crisis like we're dealing with the COVID pandemic, it is so easy to get pulled into obsessing over problems you might have 3 months from now or 6 months from now or a year from now. And as a general rule, we can't solve all those problems today, but we can have a good day today. We can deal with what's in front of us to the best of our ability, and then we can wake up tomorrow and do it again. And frankly, that's been my mantra for 18 and a half years now at Fine Tune, is let's just stack up good days, and every now and then, there's a metaphor we've used along these lines that relates to, it's a farming metaphor. We were a firm that was founded in the Midwest, and there's farmland all around, the areas where we started the business in Bloomington, Indiana. And so I often say, till the fields with pride, just till the fields every day, and eventually there'll be a harvest. And so I think that's probably, in this time, useful advice that I would give to anybody, in both broadly and specifically to this time.
Perfect. Rich, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with the Interface.net and CPOstrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate and review. And don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/The Digital Insight.